So we see Nicodemus is a Pharisee and a ruler of the Jews. John chapter 3, verse number 1. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. Well, what exactly is a Pharisee or a ruler of the Jews? Here in John chapter 1 and 2, so far we've seen each chapter we've had encounters with this group of people. Elders, rulers of the Jews, Pharisees. Later you'll see Sadducees and scribes. What is that? So what is Nicodemus when it says that he is a Pharisee or a ruler of the Jews? There is a judicial and administrative body at the time of Christ called the Sanhedrin. The word Sanhedrin comes from a Greek word which literally means sitting together or council. Okay, so we have a judicial system here in the United States. We have local district courts. We have a Supreme Court. We have a very similar body here at the time of Christ. We have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was composed of local elites, which would include members of high priestly families, scribes or religious experts, experienced teachers in the Old Testament. The Sanhedrin would make final decisions in legal disputes. They would also determine whether a priest was worthy of taking a priesthood. So the Sanhedrin would be similar to like our court system. The rulers would use the Mishnah Tractate, which is what we would consider like our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. They use that to rule off of, or they would use previous court cases. Sorry, I keep looking at Miss Jen because she's part of our judicial system. So they would use the Mishnah Tractate as like their law to compare, old cases, or this is what the law says. So it's very similar to our judicial system that we have set up now. There's two divisions of the Sanhedrin. There's the Sanhedrin, the Lesser Sanhedrin. This would be a pretty close representation of what it would look like. They would meet in a tribunal that would be set up in each city. There's 23 members of each Lesser Sanhedrin. So they would sit kind of in a circle like that. The accused or whatever, let's say you have a disagreement between two people, they would come, they would present the facts. The scribes, priests, Pharisees, whatever is part of the tribunal here, they sit around the circle, they would consider the matter, they would look at the law, and then they would decide what the outcome would be. Now, if there was no outcome, they would go to, would be the Greater Sanhedrin or the Great Sanhedrin. They would meet in Jerusalem, and it would look really similar to this. If you see here, there's actually a student seating. It'd be almost like in a law, you would have law students, people that would sit there and hear these cases. They would learn. Here they got two spots where clerks would sit to write down all the notes. You have 35 members on either side, and then in the center, you have the high priest. So there's 71 in the Great Sanhedrin. In your local areas, you have 23. Obviously an odd number. That way, if it comes to, there is no 50-50. It has to tip one way or the other. So here you have 70 members, and the 71st member is the high priest. The Great Sanhedrin meets in Jerusalem. So when Christ was being tried, this gives us a really good picture of what it looked like. Let's go to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, verse 53. I'll give you a second to get there. We'll read a couple of verses. Mark chapter 14, verse 53. I'll start reading. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and elders and scribes. So right there it says the accused. That would be Jesus Christ in this instance. We've got the chief priests, and assembled with him is the elders and the scribes and the other priests. Okay? Verse number 55, and the chief priest and all the council sought witness against Jesus to put him to death. They found none. Verse number 60, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, and then he asked him the question. So here it says that the high priest stood up in the midst, meaning the middle. So this would be a very accurate picture. Here, after they they conversed, they talked amongst themselves. Jesus is standing in the middle of all of them. They can't really find anything, that he'd be guilty of. The high priest stands up, asks a question. This is a really good picture representation of what Jesus would have been in the situation of being questioned. Okay? So this is what the Sanhedrin is. This is what the Pharisees, scribes, whenever you hear those terms, now you kind of have a mental picture that you can put it towards. So Nicodemus is part of this group. More than likely, because in chapter 2, Jesus is in Jerusalem. He goes to the Jews' Passover, throws the tables. We talked about that last week. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and then he meets Nicodemus. Nicodemus is more than likely a member of the great Sanhedrin, not just the lesser. He's probably a part of this. Jesus even alludes to that fact. Let's look at back in John chapter 3, verse number 10. John chapter 3, verse number 10. Jesus answered and said unto him, Art thou a master of Israel, and knowest not these things? Here in this conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus calls Nicodemus a master of Israel. That word master, it's, I'm going to try to say it correctly, didaskalos. It means scholar, instructor, teacher, or doctor. So he calls Nicodemus, aren't you a master? Aren't you a scholar or a doctor of Israel? Meaning not just in your area, but of all Israel you have renown. So Jesus refers to him as a teacher or a doctor. Because of Nicodemus's occupation, we see that Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night. A lot of people, and I've even heard preachers allude to the fact that, Nicodemus was a coward. He came to Jesus at night. He was afraid of what people would think. If you kind of now, knowing his background and knowing his occupation, we see Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night more or less out of wisdom. Okay? If he comes to Jesus in daytime or when he's with his other fellow, co-workers, there's a good chance that Nicodemus loses his job. Nicodemus could even be stoned if he associates with somebody later that they call a blasphemer or somebody that says that he's the Son of God. So Nicodemus has questions, but he doesn't want to put himself in a bad position. So there's a lot of people that would say Nicodemus is a coward, but I don't think that that's the case. Nicodemus understood who Jesus was. Let's look in verse number 2. The same came to Jesus by night and said unto him, Rabbi. That word rabbi means my master. Even though Nicodemus didn't understand everything that Jesus was teaching, he understood who Jesus was. He doesn't call Jesus a teacher. He doesn't call him just master. He calls him rabbi, which is my master. He understood who Jesus was. I don't think Nicodemus is a coward at all. He was not prideful to think that he had all the answers. Even though he was a man of renown, he did have a lot of answers. He understood the law. He was part of the great Sanhedrin, more than likely. But he wasn't too prideful to understand that he didn't know everything. And he knew who Jesus was, but he just had some questions for Jesus. Question that I have for you. Are you too prideful to ask questions about things that you may not fully understand? The people that I'm speaking to this morning are very knowledgeable of the Bible. You're very knowledgeable in things of life, in which is good, just like Nicodemus. But are you in the same spot in Nicodemus where maybe there's things that you don't understand, or maybe there's an issue that you have in your life, or questions that you have? Are you too prideful to ask questions? Are you too prideful to think that you can't learn something, even at maybe an older age or more experienced age? I wrote this statement down. A true coward will hide behind his pride and never ask the hard questions. Nicodemus was not a coward. A true coward hides behind his pride and never asks the hard question. A true coward will think that he has everything figured out, or even if he doesn't, he'll at least pretend that he has everything figured out and will never learn. Nicodemus was not a coward. Like I said before, The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were spiritually ignorant. We talked about that in the last couple lessons. Nicodemus was not spiritually ignorant. He saw Jesus' miracles and he understood that God was with him. Let's read the rest of verse number 2. It says, Master, we know that thou art a teacher come from God. For no man can do these miracles that thou doest except God be with him. Here in the other previous chapters, we see the Pharisees, they asked John, are you the Christ? Or who are you? If you're not this guy, if you're not this guy. They were just kind of ignorant. They weren't opening their eyes and seeing and listening. Here, Nicodemus, his eyes are open. He sees the miracles that Christ did. He hears Christ speak. He knows who Christ is. He is not spiritually ignorant. But like I said before, Jesus was not here to address physical needs. He was here to address the spiritual need. Nicodemus asks a question, and Christ dives in right away into the spiritual need of Nicodemus. Let's put our eyes on verse number 3. Jesus answered and said unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Jesus tells Nicodemus, you need to be born again. Nicodemus is definitely a little bit confused. Let's read verse number 4. Nicodemus saith unto him, How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Nicodemus, I don't think he's asking this sarcastically. I think he understands that Christ is very knowledgeable and Christ has God with him, but he just doesn't understand this. So he asks him, how can you be born again? Do you have to go back into your mother's womb and be born again? I guess I just don't understand. Christ explains what the second birth is. Verse number 5. Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh. That which is born of the Spirit is spirit. When we are conceived and are born, we physically become alive, but our spirit is not. Ephesians 2, verse 1, that verse was read already. And you hath he quickened which were dead in trespasses and sin. That word quicken means to vitalize, to make alive, to give life. So Christ tells Nicodemus that, yes, you need to be physically born, but you also need to be spiritually born. Unlike a physical birth, we cannot see it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Jesus alludes to that. Verse number 7, let's put our eyes on it. Marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born again. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell from whence it cometh, or whither it goeth. So is every one that is born of the Spirit. Just because you cannot see something does not mean that it doesn't exist. Okay? Here's a couple of things. Can you see the wind? No, you can't necessarily see the wind. Can you see gravity? No, you cannot see gravity. Can you see magnetism? No, you cannot. Can you see radio waves? Can you see the internet? All these things we cannot see. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It takes faith to believe in something that you can't see. Let's put this a little bit to the test. You cannot see the wind. Nobody has seen the wind. Do you believe that there is wind? Just yes or no. Pastor says no. He doesn't believe in the wind, okay? You cannot see the wind, but you can see the effects of the wind, right? Right now you can see the leaves are moving, the waves will be rolling. So we can't see the wind, but we know that it's there. It exists. Can you see magnetism? No, you cannot. But if you have two magnets and you start bringing them close together, they're either going to click together or they're going to repel. So we can't see magnetism, but we can see its effects, right? We can see gravity's effect when we step on the bathroom scale, okay? That scale would stay at 0 if it wasn't for that gravity. My problem is not my weight. My problem is gravity hates me. You step on that scale, and it looks like a roulette table. It starts spinning. I don't know if that was a bad reference. You can cut that out if it is. All right? We can't see gravity, but we can see its effects. When you can't see the internet, but you can see its effects. When you type an email and you send it, I can't physically see that email hop up off my screen, go over to Brother Larry, and land in his device. But it also takes faith for me to believe that. When I type that email and I hit send, I have faith that the internet is going to take that email and it's going to carry it to Brother Larry, right? It takes faith to believe in something that you cannot see. And that's what Christ tells Nicodemus. He says, you are physically born, but you can't get to heaven unless you are physically and spiritually born. And your spiritual birth, you're not going to be able to see it, but it's there. And he assures us that. We cannot physically see salvation, but we can see the effects of salvation. We can see God change lives. We can see God make an old, filthy rag into righteousness. We can see God take something that somebody would consider useless or garbage, and He can make it into something that glorifies God. We can't see salvation, but we can see its effects. And that's what Christ tells Nicodemus. So Nicodemus hears this, he contemplates it, and he asks the most important question next. Verse number 9. John chapter 3, verse number 9. Nicodemus answered and said unto him, how can these things be? Nicodemus understood what Christ is talking about. He understands who Christ is. He understands that he needs to be born again. Then he asks the most important question, how? Jesus tells him how. Verse number 14 and 15. John chapter 3, verse number 14 and 15. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Christ uses an Old Testament example to give to Nicodemus. Christ is the perfect teacher. He's going to use the perfect example, the perfect scripture, to help lead somebody to himself. Here he uses an Old Testament reference, which Nicodemus is going to be very familiar with. The brazen serpent. The children of Israel are poisoned by snake venom. They are dying. They have no hope. God tells Moses, make a brazen serpent, lift it up. Anybody who casts their eyes on this brazen serpent, they will be healed and saved. Christ uses that example. Just as Moses has lifted up the serpent, and if you look, you can live. The Son of Man is going to be lifted up on a cross. If you look on Him and believe in Him, you shall not perish, but you'll have everlasting life. Christ then goes on to tell Nicodemus about God's love for the world, and the purpose of Jesus Christ coming. I'm going to read a couple of verses if you want to follow along. We're going to read 5 or 6 verses. John chapter 3, verse number 16 is where we'll start. Pretty sure we're all pretty familiar with this. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. He that believeth on Him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For every one that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God. So here, Christ tells Nicodemus he needs to be born again. He then shows Nicodemus how he could be born again. And then he goes on to tell Nicodemus about God's love. And then tells him the purpose of Christ's coming. He said, I did not come to condemn the world. I didn't come to judge the world. That's not my purpose. My purpose is that people will be saved. If you reject Christ, you condemn yourself. The light of the Father is not in him. But he tells Nicodemus what his purpose is. A couple questions for you. Have you looked to Christ for salvation? I think in this room, that would be the majority of us, or all of us. Have you accepted Christ? Have you been born again? If so, are you explaining and showing others how to be saved, how to be born again. We see that Nicodemus didn't understand everything about salvation. Even though he knew who Christ was and he knew things about Christ, Nicodemus was very educated. He knew a lot about Christ, but he did not trust Christ for salvation. And Christ takes the time and line upon line explains to Nicodemus how to be saved, how to be born again. Are you doing that? You have the light. If you are saved, you have the light. The world is dark. They don't have the light. They may know who Christ is. They may know things about Christ. They may even go to church. Oh, I belong to such and such church. Good for them. But are they trusting Christ for salvation? We see in later, we're done with Nicodemus. We see a little bit later in John chapter 3, verse number 22 and 23, we see that we have another encounter with John the Baptist. Verse number 22, after these things came Jesus and his disciples into the land of Judea, also was baptizing in Aenon near Salem, because there was much water there, and they came and were baptized. So we see the disciples have a question for John the Baptist. Verse number 26, the disciples ask John a question. They say, and they came to John and said unto him, Rabbi, he that is with thee beyond Jordan, to whom thou bearest witness, behold, the same baptizeth, and all men come to him. So here they ask John a question, or they kind of make a statement, seeing what John says. They say, Jesus is here. He's baptizing. Verse number 22, we see that. He's baptizing people. What are you doing? Like, why are you still here? You bear witness of John, John, you bear witness of Christ, and you were pointing people to Christ. So Christ is here, and he's baptizing. What are you still doing? That's kind of the implied question that they are asking. John beautifully explains that he is not here to compete with Christ, and he's not here to interfere with Christ's mission. John chapter 3, verse number 27. And John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I am sent before him. Here John explains, I told you guys that I am not the Christ, and I understand that. And I understand that I have nothing except for what's given to me. So he tells them that. But what he says in verse number 29 actually goes very well with this weekend. Verse number 29, his answers to the disciples. He that hath the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This, my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. The groom is the happiest guy at the wedding. He gets to take the bride home and begin his new life. The groomsmen are very excited for the groom. Even if they are 100% not on board with the bride, they are still excited for. That was supposed to be funny. Even if the groomsmen aren't necessarily excited about the bride, they are excited for the groom to be able to begin this new journey and to be with his bride. They love him, they support him, and they are happy to be part of the celebration. The wedding is not about the groomsmen, but a lot of times it seems that they are just as happy, or even happier sometimes, than the groom is. It seems like no matter what wedding you're at, it seems like the groomsmen are always the loudest table. They're having a lot of fun, lots of smiles, lots of jokes. Here John tells the disciples, I am not the groom. Okay? He who gets the bride, that's the groom. Okay? But the friend of the groom is just as happy as the groom himself. All the things that John did was for Christ. And John says, the things I do for Christ, me leading people to Christ, me baptizing people, all of that is for Christ, and that is my joy. Christ gets the bride. He's the happiest guy because he gets his bride. John is just thrilled that he gets to be part of that, to be part of the celebration, to add people to the bridegroom, right? Does your joy come from the things of the Lord? John said his joy is fulfilled. in helping the groom get his bride? Is your joy fulfilled by leading other people to Christ, discipling them, adding them to the church? Are you excited about coming to church? Is it a drag? Do you not enjoy the things of the Lord? Well, if you're going to be in heaven, I hope you start learning to like the things of the Lord, because there's going to be a lot of singing and a lot of joy there. John's joy was fulfilled because his purpose in life was helping the groom and leading other people to the groom. Are you excited about the things of the Lord?